Hi, this is Tom, and I want to pre-apologize for the length of this video. I like having 6, 7, 8 minute videos, but this I've tried to hone down, but I think it's really going to help you interpret your life. Life is about interpreting events. What does this mean? It's almost the gift of interpretation. We need the gift of interpretation to get through life, and this is really going to help you, I think. And I've been talking about spiritual warfare, and specifically about the belt of truth. And I discussed the two parts of the Roman soldier's belt and applied them to the two aspects of truth. And since the belt was to be put on first, it seems to me that you and I must at minimum understand these two parts if we're going to be fully clad and effective. And John alludes to them in his epistle when he says that we have both known and believed, not just believed. Now, there is an aspect of truth that we must believe. Something has to be revealed to us, and then we believe it to be true come hell or high water. This is believing in something. But as you know, you can genuinely believe God, believe that you're a son or daughter of God, but not really live in that awareness. Your beliefs get jostled by circumstances, and then what you really believe is exposed. So knowing must be added to your believing. Truth must not only be revealed to you, it must be revealed or made real in you. The word which is external to you must become flesh, just as it says of Jesus, the word became flesh. So you must fit truth around you, just like the Roman belt. Strap it on, as it were. The belt's snugged around your waist, tight, and it doesn't move, just like the eternal word. But from that belt hung narrow metal flaps that moved and flexed as you moved. These adapted specifically to you. So for truth to be truth that works for you and truth that sets you free, it must both be unchanging and adaptable, both objective and subjective. Jesus must be revealed to you and in you, just as it was for Paul, and we're going to talk about that this time. In the Greek, there's a couple different words that's used for knowing, and one that's often used, it means to know experientially. And the Hebrew word for to know is also used for sexual intercourse. That knowing is different than getting to know Mary on a date. What was known about now becomes inward knowledge, intimate knowledge. And Paul called that no longer I, but Christ. He wrote what he knew and believed, not just what he believed. He didn't pull things out of his hat. He experienced these things. And this is God's heart for you. And the last time we talked about two of Paul's encounters with Jesus. He had many encounters, but two significant ones that are written about. The first was before he entered Damascus, and as a Christ hater. He heard a voice from heaven. Jesus was revealed to him. While this was real to Paul, his knowledge of Jesus was still external to him. Something he put his faith in, almost like he put his faith in the law. Paul pre-Christ and Paul post-Christ was still Paul. How he operated did not change. What went through regeneration is the way he did life, and that's the same for you. What goes through regeneration is all the faulty ways you did life. The way you got your way before you became a Christian is the exact way you're going to try to serve God afterwards until God reveals that. Before Jesus was revealed in him, Paul as a Christian was just like Saul the Hebrew. His subject has changed. It was no longer the law, now it was Jesus. His target market had changed. It was no longer focused on Christians but Jews, but how he tried to get others to his cause was the same. He still used the force of his personality, the shrewdness of his mind, the force of his will, the passion of his emotions to get others to come to his point of view. And Luke says in Acts that he perplexed the Jews in Damascus with his apologetics, and he debated the Hellenists in Jerusalem only to be asked to leave by the brothers. The second encounter, however, was after these events and happened to Paul as a Jesus lover. Putting together Luke's account in Acts and Paul's account in Galatians, the timeline is this. Paul stayed in Damascus for some months after his conversion. And then in Jerusalem, again, for some months he stayed there, only be sent away. Then Paul writes in Galatians that at some point after this time, he went to the desert of Arabia, and then he returned again. That's the key. He returned again to Damascus for 3 years, and he returned again to Jerusalem. This time he wasn't sent away. He became a part of the Damascus assembly and quietly went to Jerusalem to listen to Peter, not to debate with others. He wasn't sent away. He was received. He had changed, no longer controlled by his personality, but by the Spirit. And the secret was, as Paul wrote in Galatians, this little phrase, when it pleased God to reveal his Son in me. Again, to that point, he knew Jesus. He debated about Jesus. He can argue the best of them, but Jesus hadn't been revealed in him yet. So it wasn't enough for Paul to believe in Jesus. Jesus had to be revealed in him, and that happened somehow in the desert. And this is God's great desire and pleasure and imperative for you as well, for Jesus to be revealed in you. And like Jacob, who wanted God with all of his heart and used his own means to get God's approval, Paul also served God to the best of his ability in the strength of his own soul as well, until that strength ran out. He was a hammer, and everything in front of him was a nail. And my friends, what passes through regeneration is your old way of doing life. And I'm not talking about sin here. I'm talking about what Paul calls the flesh, which operates behind the scenes in default mode. It's how you do life and get your way. It could be sweetness, like it was for me, and softness. It could be vinegar, like it was for Paul. But at some point, how you do life fails. It's also how you protect your sense of self. Your sense of self, who you are, is the most precious gift God has given you, and you protect it reflexively without knowing. Psychology calls this thing defense mechanisms. Paul called it your flesh or your operating system. These abilities and your personality for sure are God-given, but unless they are broken, unless that happens, your abilities will rule you, and sadly, the work of God will be hindered. So how did you get your way before you came to Christ? That's a good question. Think about that. It'd be good for you to assess that. How did you protect yourself? Are you aware of that? I think you will find some of the residue of that still remains in your life as you try to navigate life and figure out life and make life work for you. It often takes the world crashing down around you in a moment of clarity for the process of transformation to begin and for truth to become the truth that sets you free. Your presumptions about yourself and about God, about those you have put on a pedestal, must have a pin put in it. Jacob had a pin put into his self-confidence. Isaiah had a pin put into his reliance upon a king. Peter had a pin put into his self-image. When did God stick his pin in you? It just might have been when you got married and you discovered your way of doing things wasn't working. For Paul, how he did life was as a Pharisee wasn't working as a Christian. As a Pharisee, he was able to stir others up to his righteous cause, but as a Christian, arguing and demanding and proving you're right wasn't working. And that's why the brothers in Jerusalem got rid of him. Luke writes after he left that the church in the entire region had peace and grew. Think about that. This is telling and indicting. And so as I look at Paul, I know this principle of Jacob that God has to break our natural strength for him to use us. It had to have happened to Paul. Paul did not come out of the Christian womb as a super saint. He went through the same process. And as I read my heart, I've seen the same process in me. So as with Jacob's encounter with God, two things happened in Paul's life before this transformation began. First, there was a shaking of his presumptions, and then he had a glimpse of his real self. And that happened, I think, after Jerusalem, because what he was selling again The brothers weren't buying. The Jews weren't buying. And at that point, he realized that how he was living life wasn't working. And so he basically realized that he was a fraud. And so what happens when that happens in some people? Some people continue to blame their spouse, or worse, get divorced. Some in ministry get rid of elders or go to another position and keep doing the same thing when they come to a place where what they're doing isn't working. We have such a strong will, some of us, and keep going, and some of us really have a lot of defense mechanisms. But when Paul realized that he was not the end-all be-all, instead of blaming, he went to the desert and had it out with God. And there in the desert, he discovered the grace of God. There in the desert, he realized and came to the realization that God loved him. Paul in all of his brokenness, Paul in all of his potentiality, Paul in his imperfections and perfections. This was a Paul that God loved, and how it caused his heart to rest, and it began to change him, began to set him free. And he no longer carried God and the law and all the shoulds that accompany the law around on his shoulders, because God carried him. And what a difference it made. It was no longer Paul, but Christ. It was still Paul, but in the diminutive. While he still possessed all the same gifts, all the same personality, they no longer possessed or controlled him, because he can be in your face or demure. He can speak boldly. He can be quiet. He can be in tears. He can be a mother. He can be a father. He can be all things to all people, because God had broken that crusty soul of his, and his spirit was released. And so have you experienced this yet? You might look back and remember the time when your illusions went poof. And what did you do? Again, some people hide. Some people just give up. It might have been with your ministry or with your church or your spouse. Again, I said in the beginning about interpreting life. And if you've had those moments and just didn't handle it rightly at that time, you can remember and go back and say, God, I'm listening. And what I found in my life is, from that point when I really saw who I was, and it wasn't pretty, that I began to change. I didn't try to change myself at that point, because Jesus says, if you know the truth will set you free. And so you can discover the love of God for who you are in all your brokenness and all of your amazing potential. And you're going to find the same thing. God begins to change you. So next time, I'm going to discuss the breastplate of righteousness. And I think you're going to find that illuminating also. But until next time.